The film is called Atrocity Incorporated: How Israel Sells Its Destruction. It's about 45, 47 minutes long. And you're probably sick of doing the elevator description of it, so I will. You can tell me if I'm wrong. The it puts together news clips and other sources of information to show not only how Israel has been spreading misinformation to promote support for genocide, but how American officials and news organizations have been stunningly complicit in that, and ends with a kind of moral conclusion on it. Is that a fair thumbnail?
Yeah, thanks for saving me the breath there. That was pretty
Yeah.
accurate.
Yeah, I wasn't worried about your breath, but I figured you said it many times. And I will say about the film that, although because I report on this stuff too, I knew virtually everything in real time, the Tony Blinken news conferences or the CBS reportage or whatever. It was still stunning to me to see it put together the way it was put together, that it becomes the most kind of damning indictment of a massive campaign of doublethink or designed to justify atrocity that I could have imagined. So, well done. What made you think to do it? I mean, I think a lot of us that cover this stuff are so immersed in it, sometimes we forget to step back and kind of synthesize it all. So, what made you think to do that?
Well, this is the work I've been doing since, I guess, October 12th, when Israel started rolling out the lies from the kibbutzim that were attacked in southern, in Israel's southern so-called Gaza envelope. And, in an operation that was kind of a special forces operation by Hamas, in which military bases, which were embedded in and around the kibbutzim, were attacked, and Hamas aimed to get as many hostages and prisoners of war, including active duty Israeli soldiers, as possible. Um, some atrocities definitely occurred. I mean, civilians were shot trying to escape, for example. And that wasn't enough for Israel to sell what it has wanted to do really since 1948, which is to just end the Palestinian question, to end Palestinians as a nation, to destroy them as a people and scatter them to the wind, and destroy the infrastructure of Gaza, which was really the cradle of Palestinian resistance, unbroken. This is a plan that had been on the table. It's playing out today in the north of Gaza. For anyone who's paying attention, they can see that there's a clear plan of ethnic cleansing. And it couldn't have been marketed to the American public by just saying, well, Hamas did this in order to spur a prisoner exchange, and they killed civilians by shooting them in the course of trying to get hostages while there was fire. And, here's the video. Here's everything we have documented on video. And there was tons of video. I mean, there are thousands and thousands of hours of video of what took place on October 7th. The video didn't contain any evidence of babies being beheaded, of babies even being intentionally killed, of children being intentionally killed, of women being sexually assaulted. None of that was there, but that became the bedrock of Israel's presentation to the Western public, that what took place on October 7th was this barbaric, savage, Mau-Mauing assault that was designed just to kill Jews with no political context at all. And it was the worst killing of Jews since the Holocaust. It basically was another Holocaust, and Israel, therefore, should be given the right to do whatever is necessary to prevent it from happening again, including basically committing genocide. So that is what I started chipping away at on October 12th, or was it October 15th? I think it was the 12th, when CNN led with the lie, supposedly confirmed by the prime minister's office, that 40 babies had been beheaded by Hamas. And we exposed the source of it, showed how it was fake. Next, we moved on to the death toll itself of 1,400 innocent people, showing that many had actually been killed by Israel under this bizarre Hannibal directive, which allows the Israeli military to kill its own citizens, including soldiers, when they believe they've been taken captive to deny the enemy any political leverage for a prisoner swap.
Or
Israeli
that they might be taken captive, is my understanding of it as well.
might
If
be.
is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was attacked harshly in Israeli media. All the Washington Post published a piece calling me a October 7th denier. And then those same outlets wound up confirming everything that we were saying at the Gray Zone, and then some. It appears that Israel may have killed hundreds of its own citizens on October 7th in the melee with a furious helicopter and drone assault. Same
Well,
kind of tactic.
Max, I after I read one of your pieces on it, and you cited one of the Israeli newspapers. I can't remember the newspaper, but a conservative-leaning newspaper. Not that those terms are meaningless basically in Israeli politics now, but a kind of pro Netanyahu newspaper that has a weekly magazine called 7 Days or something. And they did a detailed report on the Hannibal directive pretty early on in the past year that you quoted from. So I went and found it and had used Google Translate and AI Translate to, get an English language version. And it was everything you said and more. It was, helicopter pilots being told, you'll know the specifics better than I, but basically, fire at anything that moves. You're cleared to fire. And by fire, we mean with rockets and so on. So, and then you had countless horror images, as you point out, and they are horrifying, of, cars that have been burned to fuse metal without anybody pointing out that it takes something like a rocket to do that. It's not something that Hamas fighters could bring across a fence. So on and on. One of the things they've been brilliant at, and I wanted to talk to you about this, is is it's uncomfortable to say, for me anyway, and maybe it's not for you, but I do it, but it's uncomfortable to say, well, they say 1,400, you still hear that figure, but really it was 1,200, several hundred were probably killed by Israeli military, and then three, 400, maybe 300 of them were soldiers, so they were not civilian deaths as reported. So now we're getting into the 600, 700 people range. Because a part of me feels, and I think part of the people listening to me feels, well, like you're quibbling uh, over death and what's wrong. And then you step on all sorts of taboos if you say, well, I don't see any evidence the rape took place, because we're told believe women, but there actually was no testimony from women, direct testimony on that, with one or two horrific exceptions that I've seen. Uh, but do you get what I'm saying? They make it so that people feel queasy talking about it or hearing about it, which I think is a
Yeah, it's like you're questioning the Holocaust. That's what they tried to do. They're going to
uh,
lie. They're going to deploy their lie again and again through the CNN effect to uh, to brand it permanently in the psyche of the Western public, so that every time they see dead babies in Gaza, they think, well, what did they think was going to happen? This is what they get for raping all those women and beheading babies, and these people are Hamas. That's the whole point of it. And so it's important to have someone out there actually holding the Israeli propaganda apparatus accountable for lying and showing how the Western corporate media is acting as their mighty Wurlitzer. And we were one of the few outlets to do that. I mean, we shredded to pieces the New York Times front page article, which was the culmination of a propaganda construct conceived in Tel Aviv, alleging that mass rape had occurred on October 7th. I mean, we demolished that piece and caused, along with other outlets, like independent outlets like Electronic Intifada, an internal crisis for the New York Times, where management was actually hauling in Muslim and Arab staffers and interrogating them about who was leaking about the crisis. They had to cancel their podcast on that article. They fired the main reporter on the article. It was, we showed it to be false from top to bottom. One of the key uh, people killed on October 7th who featured in that article as sort of exhibit A of Hamas savagery and sexual perversion. The family, the bereaved family, actually came out and said the New York Times lied and manipulated them. But yet the article hasn't been retracted. But this features prominently in Atrocity Incorporated, along with lies spun out by CNN's Jake Tapper, who is an ideologically committed Zionist, Dana Bash, who attempted to shut down Pramila Jayapal during an interview in which Jayapal was citing her all of the death toll of civilians, the horrific humanitarian situation in Gaza in order to push for a ceasefire resolution. And Dana Bash said, well, at least Israel isn't raping anybody. She literally said that. And so I exposed these figures in Atrocity Incorporated. And it's basically the work that I've been doing for the past year. The way that it came about, to answer your first question, is I gave a talk at the University of Massachusetts about what was happening on campuses across the US and the significance of the student protest movement that we saw during the last school year, particularly during the spring semester. And UMass students who had been participating in those protests, the ones who showed up to my talk, were actually kind of exhausted because they had all spent the night in prison, many of them with their hands zip tied behind their backs for about 8 hours. Women hadn't been allowed to attend to their periods by campus police. People, they'd been basically subjected to abuse, couldn't go to the bathroom, all because they had set up an encampment in the middle of campus protesting this genocide. And so I was there to do that talk, and I was sponsored by a professor of media studies named Sut Jolly, who had directed and written a really important film called The Occupation of the American Mind, about the role of the Israel lobby in crafting media propaganda to support the greater Israel agenda. Everyone watching this should watch that film. And Soot interviewed me. And after the interview, he said, why don't we just turn this interview into a documentary about all of this work debunking the atrocity propaganda Israel's put out to justify its genocide, to manufacture consent for the horrors that it's committing in Gaza. And so I went back to UMass after writing what I wrote would have been an hour and a half long. We edited it down to 45 minutes. And then I delivered this mono in one sitting. And then I worked with my friends at independent media group called Propaganda and Company to just edit it together. It took about 2 weeks of production. It was a rush job, and we delivered it on October 7th for the anniversary. And yeah, if you have any questions about what happened or why this is happening, I think that film will help you understand not just what gave Israel the space to do what it's currently doing in Gaza, which is the United Nations has ruled as extermination in northern Gaza in a report last week, but also how the media functions in the US as an instrument of state terror and apartheid and of regime change the world over. This isn't just about Israel. It's about Syria. Right. It's about Libya. It's about Iraq. It's about all the regime change operations the US wages because in collaboration with their proxies. I mean, I guess you could say it's also about Ukraine, Russia. They use something called the CNN effect. This term was coined by my friend Pierce Robinson in a 1999 paper about Yugoslavia and the NATO intervention there, which relies on continuous propagandizing of the Western public, showing them either real or fabricated atrocities again and again and again to generate support for Western policy, and CNN is the main instrument for it. So, what do you see right now on CNN? Do you see the same kind of horrors and concoction of horrors that we saw after October 7th in relation to Jewish Israeli civilians and soldiers? No. But right now, Gaza is going through an unprecedented nightmare. It is, in my view, the Holocaust of our time, and Israel is seeking to ethnically cleanse 100,000 people from the north in order to prevent them from ever returning to their homes. And it's doing so through bombardment, simultaneously bombing civilian areas across Lebanon. Do you see the CNN effect in play right now? Are we seeing CNN constantly replay the images that you can see on Twitter, where just yesterday video emerged of a little girl with half her skull missing, where photos are anywhere for you to see of children in their diapers shredded to pieces by US weapons and Israeli forces in the Jabalia refugee camp. These are refugee children. No, it's nowhere to be found there because the collective Western governments that are funding and sponsoring this genocide don't want a shift in policy. They genuinely don't want a shift in policy. Tony Blinken was just in Israel. He's right now rubbing shoulders with Saudi monarchs and rustling up new contracts for when he goes back into the private sector. Did he really want a ceasefire? Did he really want to end this? Because if he did, the State Department has so much influence over what you see in corporate media, which is not independent and absolutely functions as this mighty Wurlitzer for the CIA, Pentagon, and State Department. He
And
could have,
so does the
could have
State
activated.
Department. You know, Max, there was a time, and I compiled all this data on that, including JFK's so-called peace speech, which I saw you said something about the other day. The State Department used to have a mission statement that was find diplomatic alternatives to war. Now I see the State Department as the sales team for the war. They're the guys with the like teal jackets and name tags saying, "Can I interest you in this?" It, I don't see any sense of diplomacy as an inherently valuable alternative to mass killing anymore. I mean, I'm sorry, I got a little agitated there, but I think it's an important point when you bring up a Tony Blinken.
Yeah. I mean, Blinken lied on October 31st, and you'll see him in Atrocity Incorporated in testimony before the Senate when he was asked why he's not actually working for a ceasefire. That's when there should have been a ceasefire.
Right.
So many lives could have been saved, and we wouldn't be careening towards war with Iran. But he declared that, in fact, Hamas had tortured an entire family to death, severed the arms of a mother and father and their children, and then had lunch in the living room of the family. And this was a complete lie, a complete fabrication that had been cooked up by one man from an organization called Zaka, which poses as a rescue organization and was in the kibbutzim days after October 7th and has made millions of dollars in fundraising off of the tall tales that it spun out after October 7th. His name is Yossi Landau. And Blinken just repeated this lie in order to demonstrate, in his words, what Israel is dealing with.
And I don't think there's any question that he knew it was a lie. I mean,
No,
uh,
I think he's actually pretty stupid.
oh,
And
he is. Okay. So, in fairness to him, he's stupid and maybe he believed it. But this
it
is
doesn't matter. They needed the script. They
right.
needed the script to deploy. So let's say he knew it was a lie. Let's say he didn't know. It doesn't matter. He needed a script. He got it from Israeli hucksters, and he used it in the Senate to push back on the need for a ceasefire. And now he's on his 11th trip to Israel, now claiming that it's time for a ceasefire. Israel's achieved its goals, but it actually hasn't because he doesn't acknowledge what Israel's true goals are, which is the destruction of the Palestinians as a people, the crushing of Gaza. But you said that you don't see the State Department as a diplomatic entity, and that's right. I mean, the U.S. doesn't do diplomacy; it does military, and it uses diplomacy as a weapon within hybrid warfare. But to but it's more naked than we might even realize. The State Department openly declares that it is a salesman for weapons and has an entire web page on its site touting all the weapons sales that it is orchestrated around the world. The State Department was extremely proud of arranging this September a $20 billion arms sale to Israel. $20 billion in the midst of a genocide. And it's proud of it. Why? Because they're creating jobs, they're fueling the American economy, and that money will come back to the US to fuel one of our few productive industries. That's how they see themselves. Where was Tony Blinken before he was Secretary of State? He was running a boutique consulting firm called West Exec Advisors, which had contracts with Saudi firms as well as Israeli spy tech firms. And you know who handled the spy tech firm contract for Tony Blinken's West Exec Advisors? It was Jen Psaki,
I thought so,
White
yeah.
House press secretary, who now has a like one of the top propaganda shows on MSNBC for Biden Harris. He has Michelle Flournoy running the firm now. She didn't make it into the administration, but she's basically keeping the seat warm for Tony Blinken to come back in. And when Gaza's totally destroyed, Tony Blinken can come back to his firm and start working with companies in the United Arab Emirates, as well as mercenary firms, surveillance firms, through all of the connections he has now. You know, few people have more connections than him to establish a new neoliberal totalitarian administration, post-Hamas administration in Gaza. That's where we seem to be going. So this is not just about a diplomatic failure on the part of the Biden administration and Tony Blinken. It's about a financial cash cow, and the State Department is pretty open about that.
And I have to go back and reread it, but I actually read the various versions of the supplemental spending package, the $98 billion or so package that was passed to give more money to the Ukraine war, Israel, and militarization of the South China Sea and so on. And plus 2% for unspecified humanitarian aid. But I think there was money specifically designated in there, additional money for the State Department to sell weapons. I have to go back and check. But I want to pivot before we go to what's happening now. You know, you mentioned that this is clearly an intentional genocide. I think, one of us should do a time lapse photography of how the attacks, drove people southward, drove people in different directions, besides slaughtering them and starving them. Now expanding into attacks on Lebanon. And it seems to me that this mighty Wurlitzer, this media political ecosystem, is hard at work now, spinning up for a war with Iran in some way, shape, or form. First of all, I've begun to see all the stories we used to get about how Russia's trying to interfere with the election. In the last couple of weeks, I've started to see Russia and Iran are trying to interfere in the election. But then we have the singling out of individuals, which to me is a classic war technique. And it's not to say that every conflict doesn't have bad individuals, but whether it's get Hirohito in World War II or whatever, they made a big deal about the various Sinwar and others, without talking about the underlying conditions that create the conflict. And now, we're hearing more scare stuff about Iran's nuclear ability. This ain't Iraq. Iraq was a catastrophe. This is a lot bigger country and with more resources. Am I nuts, or are we being prepped for a gigantic conflict, which is what it would be if we went after or with Israel or backed Israel going after Iran?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who lived through the war on terror, so-called war on terror, and the post 9/11 era knows what it feels like and what kind of social damage can be done when we're being prepped for a much wider, almost messianic military campaign of regime change and war. After 9/11, there were several fake terror busts across the United States. Muslim American leadership was hauled in, put on trial, accused of being involved in international terror. The cases were completely fake. Most of them were Palestinians. The Holy Land Five,
Right.
who was them? They're in prison for life, and all they were doing was sending aid from that they'd raised among Muslims in the in the state of Texas to Gaza to charities that also were supported by USAID and the Red Cross, which have all been destroyed by Israel. These guys are in jail forever, and it was all about keeping the American public frayed and gripped with the sense that there are terrorists living next door. Then the FBI set about concocting hundreds and hundreds of fake terror cases through manufactured plots. During the run up to the Iraq War, the FBI went around interviewing Iraqi Americans. And it's happening again. It's happening again without the same media interest, but with media participation.
Mm.
Just look at the New Yorker has a completely propagandistic puff piece about some foreign threat center that has been set up in the Biden administration to protect Americans from threatening foreign media and digital interference by the enemy states. And it has all the same hucksters that helped create the Russiagate hoax, like Clint Watts. People have been discredited, but are being propped up again by elite liberal publications that the intelligentsia reads. The Washington Post has a piece today by one of the top CIA tools in the US media, Joseph Menn, claiming that Russia, according to unnamed US officials, not a single source is named in this article, Russia is trying to throw the election to Trump through some largely unidentified Twitter and social media operations. And so then the Trump administration, not Trump administration, the Trump Incorporated is driving this freak out within MAGA circles about not just Iran interfering in US politics, but Iran seeking to assassinate Trump as revenge for Trump's assassination of Major General Qasem Soleimani.
Right.
And this is all the background noise for an election, which will obviously clearly be decided by domestic factors in which most Americans are voting based on their views of two issues, abortion and immigration, the culture wars.
Right.
And, there are obviously smaller groups voting on what I guess a consultant would call like micro issues or micro trends, like the Gaza war, which may shape how Michigan swings. But these are real factors. And what the intelligence services are seeking to do is set up some foreign country, an enemy state where they want regime change and sanctions and war to blame for upsetting half the country, whether it's Russia or Iran. And what is the US doing right now? It is sponsoring a war on Russia's borders in which, until recently, a large element within the Biden administration, led by Tony Blinken, was pushing for giving Ukraine long-range missiles to strike inside Moscow, specifically British Storm Shadow missiles. And then you have the US establishing a air bridge of 500-pound, 2,000-pound bombs and every other kind of weapon imaginable to deliver to Israel so that it has the capacity to strike Iran. In fact, the US is helping Israel select targets in Iran and trying to prevent it from striking Iranian nuclear facilities by bribing Israel with more weapons. It's like, we don't want you to go on this massive military blitzkrieg. We're going to give you all the weapons possible to do so. That's a really good diplomatic tactic.
That's
So
how I conquered my addictions, is they bribed me with more drugs.
That's what the US is doing. The media is playing the perfect role here in an election season in trying to convince American voters that these countries are actually waging war on us, and that wars on them might actually be justified because they're destroying our democracy. And there's simply no evidence to support any of it. Another insane statement by the Biden administration that I think wasn't didn't get enough attention was National Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines claiming that Iran was paying American students to protest
Mm.
the genocide in Gaza. How would they do that? I mean, there's no evidence provided in her bulletin. And how would Iran even do that with sanctions in place and given the fact that they struggle to pay their own government employees under such crushing sanctions? So this has just been continuous since Russiagate. It's one reason why we thought it was important to call out Russiagate, was because this is all about greasing the skids for a nuclear war.
Or certainly the risk of it. It seems to me, and I don't see any peace movement yet with any real teeth in it. Certainly not in the electoral system. So I guess it's up to, journalists and activists and people like that to keep up the pressure in the meantime, because it's freaking scary and it's inhumane, and people are being slaughtered every day in our name, by our country. So I guess that's my way of closing by saying that's why journalism like yours is so important, and why I appreciate you doing it, and why I appreciate you coming on the program, Max Blumenthal.
Yeah, thanks as always, RJ. Thanks for what you're doing.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.